Psalms 89 is a psalm about God making a covenant with his servant David. It's about the Davidic covenant, his throne. God says, one of your descendants will sit on your throne forever. Didn't look like that, though. There are a lot of pretenders. Looked like the Gentiles occupied that throne for hundreds of years. And yet God would continually say, no, I haven't violated the covenant that I made with my servant David. Because part of that covenant was that you continue to believe. If you become disobedient, I'll punish you. So those that would seem to sit on the promised throne don't sit on that throne at all. That's our hope, because ultimately, son would be born, son that would sit on David's throne forever. Our King, our Lord, our Master. And all of the Old Testament looks forward to this piece of scripture. It's in Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. It says, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave. So he is the owner of everything, but he's under guardians and managers, under schoolmasters, Paul would say in chapter 3. The word there is paideia. It means to child train for who the child is. So he's under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. Come on, there's a date that's set. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time came, that had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to accomplish this, to redeem his people, or those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. And so when Nebuchadnezzar knocked on Jerusalem's door, began tearing the walls down, began disassembling the temple, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. When Belshazzar saw the writing on the wall, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. When Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon and took over for the Medo-Persian Empire, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. When Darius sent Ezra back, when Xerxes sent his troops against Greece, when Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah back, when Esther was on the throne, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. When the goat was destroying the ram, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. When the horn on the goat was broken and 4 came up in its place, God was looking forward to the fullness of time. Looking forward to the fullness of time when a son would be born of a woman, born under the law. Because God kept his promise about the throne of David. Him who was born symbolically or traditionally, as we celebrated it yesterday, the fullness of time was accomplished. It was done. But this son who was born, we need to visualize him in this way. As the shepherd, the good shepherd, who is the door of the sheepfold. Our study will be in John chapter 10 this morning. We'll be turning there. And the reason I've chosen John chapter 10 is that the fullness of time is so significant for us as Christians, because that's when the shepherd would be born that would carry us. The great symbol of being a Christian is being a sheep across the shoulders of the shepherd, of being utterly dependent, of being protected. This last week, I read an article about an archaeological discovery from the 3rd century. It was made, it's a Roman galleon, a Roman ship that had been sunk in the harbor of Caesarea. Herod the Great had restored and built Caesarea and increased its harbor size. It was a deep harbor, and so it became a very important piece for the Romans in their distribution of goods. Philip was the evangelist there. Paul spent 2 years in prison there. That's where he met Felix, Acts 24. Cornelius was baptized there. He was the first Gentile baptized. So the church in Corinth, in Caesarea, with Philip being the preacher there, along with his family, would be the first Gentile church. Interesting historical piece. Anyway, this Roman ship that was discovered, they found in it a very small gold ring with a green stone in it. And carved on the stone was a shepherd with a sheep or a goat across his shoulders. Not 3rd century. And the article, which came from the Smithsonian Magazine, made the point that it was the common Christian symbol that existed then, the shepherd with the sheep over his shoulders. I don't know if that's true or not, I just read it. But what I thought was the church meeting in Caesarea in the 3rd century, that's 1700 years ago, apparently acknowledged the shepherd with the sheep across his shoulder. And so I thought we need to take a look and be encouraged by John chapter 10, because that's what all the fullness of time pointed to. Was the good shepherd being born that would carry his sheep. And so, as John, in John chapter 10, as John begins to write, he writes about this shepherd. He says, number one, there's the sheepfold. So you have a picture of this corral, if you will, in my language, but where the sheep are located. And there's a door there that you get into that sheepfold. Now, apparently you can access the sheepfold from different locations or different positions, but there's only one way to get into it, and that's through the door. And so the sheepfold will represent the whole system over which the shepherd reigns. Because the only way you can get into this sheepfold is through this door. Now, in verses 1 to 6 here, John will say this is a parable. He says, I'm telling you a story. And going forward in verse 7, he will interpret or will describe the story. And so get in your mind a picture of the sheepfold that's full of sheep. I don't know if you've ever been around sheep. I've been around them a little bit, but they're a bit noisy, they stir. So there's a lot going on. Now, this is an important figure for us to understand because it's an important figure in God's vision in what he is communicating. In Psalm 78 and verse 70, you can just jot it down. David is described as being the shepherd of Israel. God took him from the sheep pens, where literally he was ministering to the sheep and helping them to bear their young. Not really a very pretty picture. But that's where David, whom God makes a covenant with, and the covenant would include the shepherd carrying the sheep, is pictured in Psalms 78 in this activity. And so we see here the sheepfold that's no different than what David was in. And in this figure of speech or this parable that's being communicated, we see the door. We also see in it, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. So once again, in the picture here, we see the sheepfold, the door, we see a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. And so we see the shepherd who goes in the door. We'll see later on that the gatekeeper opens the door for him. And we'll also see that this shepherd is the door. To him, the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech, or this parable Jesus used with them, but they do not understand what he was saying to them, and so he'll explain it. Now, it's very important that you reflect back on all the studies that we've had from the exile beginning in 605 BC to this point, the fullness of time. And it's important because these are Jews that Jesus is telling this parable to. Gentiles wouldn't understand what he's saying. Jews would. Because for 600 years, the thieves and the robbers have just destroyed it. That's what we talked about. Over and over again, because of their unbelief, the thieves and the robbers entered the sheepfold in the parable and destroyed it. Tried to. And even though they didn't know it, God, being the shepherd during those times, protected them, fought for them, loved them, even though they didn't love him back, at least not all. Now, the significance is we need to learn that lesson from the Old Testament so that we can understand the power and the love and the protection that the fullness of time brought. Of this shepherd carrying his sheep on his shoulder. And so Jesus tells this parable to you. Just to repeat it, he's the door, it's trust. The gatekeeper, he calls his sheep by name and leads them out. See, God had always called his people by name. He'd always acknowledged them. He'd always kept his promises. He'd always led them in and out. They hadn't always followed him. They hadn't always known his voice. But the history of Old Testament, particularly in our studies from 605 to date, is a study of the voice of strangers that God's people listen to. That's the parable. And so then there's the reveal in verse 7, starting in verse 7. I want us to look in chapter 10 at these verses. Jesus again said to them, truly, I say to you, I am the door to the sheep of the sheep. The word I am there is the word regarding God Jehovah. It is the word that says, I am present in the present tense right now. Jesus says, I am right now, I exist, I am. In the original language, the word is powerful. It's the word em, I. Emi. It's the word to be in the present, the eternal present. And so we have here all that God did in the Old Testament that we've been talking about, studying, is coming to fruition, because what exists right here in the I am had always existed, exists, and will always exist. That was the Davidic covenant that God made, an everlasting covenant with David, that on that throne his descendants would sit forever. Jesus is saying, they're saying, and so this door, once again, he says, I'm the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers. Nebuchadnezzar, 606 BC, when the first deportation went. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar was a robber. He was a thief. The ones that came after him, Nabonidus, Evil-Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, were thieves and robbers. I mean, you remember Belshazzar sitting with all his cronies at this big party, using the utensils that he had taken from the temple of God Almighty, that God himself had given the directions and given the ability to make. And Belshazzar is praising the gods of the gold and the gods of the silver. And all of a sudden there's a hand that comes on the wall and says, right? Babylonians were just thieves and robbers. The Medo-Persians brought all of the thievery into Susa, into the Persian kingdom. Darius would give it back. Medo-Persia was the charging ram that subjugated the whole world. They were just thieves and robbers. Alexander the Great, the he-goat, was nothing but a thief and robber. I mean, he stole more and robbed more and destroyed more in 3 or 4 years than anybody had ever done before. It's amazing what he did. Point here for the Jewish mind, when he says, I'm the door of the sheep, all who came before me are thieves and robbers. Listen, he's describing their history. He's saying, I'm naming names and taking pictures. He says, I am the door, in verse 9. If anyone enters by me, he will. And then there's a list. See, God had always said this. You obey me. You follow me. You put aside all the false gods. You don't listen to all the false stuff going on. And here's what I'll do. I'll save you. I'll protect you as you go in and out of the fold. I'll provide for you. I'll give you pasture. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and gets out of there, flees. Then the wolf snatches and scatters the sheep. That's what had always happened. That's not new news. That's what the Babylonians had done. It's what the Medo-Persians had done. It's what the Greeks had done. It's what Rome had done and is doing right now. But it's the fullness of time. And him who was born is the good shepherd. Wasn't Babylon, wasn't Medo-Persia, wasn't Greece, wasn't Rome. It'll be this good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Verse 14 says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them in also. And so he's saying, this is a bigger picture than what we've ever talked about. Well, I know in the Old Testament, I talked about it a lot. But now it's a reality, and that is the Gentiles are also included, because there's not going to be any division on this earth. There's one sheepfold. There's one sheepfold. There's one shepherd. So Jesus says to them, I must have them also. They will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. See, that's what it meant. That's what the throne of David meant. It meant a shepherd sitting on that throne, his descendant, that would unify and provide for all God's purpose. But you got to be on his shoulders. You got to be in his fold. There's only one way to get into the fold. That's through the door. That's through him. And you see, today we struggle at times, I think, as God's people have always struggled. And that is, isn't there another way? I mean, you really understand me? You understand this society? You understand what's going on? You understand the pressure? You understand what I'm confronted with every day? You understand that I'm hungry? I don't have all that I need, but all I want. You understand I'm structured out? I mean, make the list. You see, the promise of the sheepfold is the promise of the throne of David. It's the promise of him who sits on that throne, who is the good shepherd. And if you contrast that with the thief and the robber, what's the contrast is the thief and the robber steal, kill, and destroy. Sees trouble and runs. Cares nothing for the sheep. And the result is that they're snatched and scattered. You see, if we understand what we've studied during the exile, if we understand Esther, if we understand Daniel, then we see the meaning of being snatched and scattered. That was the point. God, in his Davidic promise to David in Psalms 89 says, if you don't believe me, I will scatter you. I will punish you. That's what he did. And he used Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome to do it. Now, for the Jew, do you understand that? Does it take another 600 years? Because the fulfillment of time, the fulfillment of the ages has come. Him who will sit on David's throne forever was born. Born by a woman, born under the law. This is him talking. This is him who was carved on a little green stone that was on a Roman merchant ship that was discovered some 1700 years later. It was a symbolic picture of the shepherd with the sheep on his shoulders. Because you see, in the sheepfold, thief and the robber don't have any power because we don't even listen to their voice. Do we? We only hear the voice of the shepherd. That's him whom we follow. And yet the thieves and the robbers and the power of their voice and the appeal of their voice is as real today as ever before. Many times I catch myself kind of wondering, how in the world would you ever go after a stone god, turn your life over and turn away from the living? How would you do that? I'm confronted with that every single day. Of listening and chasing the other gods that have only one purpose, and that's to kill and destroy, to scatter. You see, the point here is that God had taught that lesson graphically to the Jewish nation. And now the end of it is at hand. Now the fulfillment of the promises is at hand. They've learned it for 600 years. They've learned that lesson. And now we've got the fulfillment of the promise. Come on. And he says, they listen to my voice. So you're not going to be snatched and scattered anymore. And he winds up with one of the amazing couple of scriptures. He says in verse 16, now listen to my voice, so there will be one flock and one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord, because I have the authority to lay it down and take it back. He says, I have the authority to choose the time, the place, the people, to turn my life over to give my life to be crucified, to be dead, to be buried. I have the authority to do that. Nebuchadnezzar thought he had that authority. In fact, they addressed Nebuchadnezzar as, O king, live forever. God had to have been chuckling, right? I mean, looking back, we can study those things and understand the reality of it, understand the seriousness of it, but understanding what we have as good shepherd, we can take a chuckle with that. Because here is him who lives forever, because he has the authority to live forever. Not only did he have the authority to turn his life over to be killed, at his place, at his time, he also had the power to be raised back up, to take his life again. That's what was born when the fulfillment of time took place. So instead of echoing what Nebuchadnezzar heard, O king, live forever, our statement is the statement of eternity that says, O king, you live forever. Him whom we serve for eternity. Not for hundreds of years, not for thousands of years, not for millions of years, but eternity. You live forever. I pray that as we think about these things, as we meditate on these things, we deeply convicted and moved by the Good Shepherd, by the sheepfold that we inhabit, that we live in. And that as we are led in and out, we are led by the voice and the person of the shepherd. We're protected, provided for, and we have life that's lived abundantly. That's John 10. And on the cross, on the hill of Calvary, it was him who said, "It's my choice to be here." It's him who said, "I have the power to be here." It's by my authority that you're driving these nails. It's by my authority that you break my legs. It's by my authority that you put me in that tomb. It's by my authority that that stone rolls away. It's by my authority that I take my place on the throne of David forever for you, your shepherd. Is that what?
Amen.
As I say, works for me. And God richly bless us with his promises, with his purpose, as we bow before the throne.